Hello and welcome to the Atma Paradigm Consciousness-based science, and we're now on the seventh session of this first part on consciousness. So today we're looking at Atma, the evidence, scientific evidence confirming that consciousness is non-physical. Now just a quick recap. Previously we provided evidence and analysed it to show that there is a need to postulate consciousness as a fundamental property, that the other theories and the actual evidence of the brain activity revealed that we could not explain the actual nature of consciousness as we have analysed it through these previous sessions. So we propose that we understand consciousness in this way, that there is an Atma. This is an entity composed of and imbued with consciousness. And we take that as our starting point. And then we consider that separate from the Atma and as the entity of consciousness, there is another thing we call mind, a non-dual neural interface facilitating the interaction between consciousness of the Atma and the body, and particularly the brain. So we have shown how this model actually better fulfills even the justifications given for the brain model, and it also fulfills many, many other aspects of the analysis of psychology and neuroscience. And last week we gave 12 key features of the Atma as offered within the tradition of Vedanta, which is one of the special schools of philosophy of ancient India. And we'll be using those insights to help us develop the Atma paradigm model as we move along. So where we were last week and where we've got to now is that the clearest way of modeling our conscious experience is to differentiate unique functions at work, specifically these three elementary functions. We start with, on the right, the body with its senses, and the senses gather information from the world around us, and the brain processes that data. But then there's another function which seems to be at work. It's what we're calling loosely for now mind. We will give a bit more precision and depth to this much later on in the series. But for now we're calling it mind, and this seems to be the function that interprets and converts the data that's there in the brain and presents it in the form of qualia. Now it is important to know what qualia are, and that was of course covered in I think our third talk. So if you're going to kind of refresh yourself on anything, that would be the one to do it. So the mind presents that data as qualia, and it is the Atma, the conscious entity, that receives that and experiences that data as qualia, and that becomes our conscious experience. This explains why information comes to us from the world around us, but when it's processed in the brain it's simply electricity, but we experience that as imagery, as sounds, as smells, and as fragrances and tastes and things, as the actual qualia. So this is our model so far. Now today I'm going to present some of the challenges to this model, and I'm also going to present some of the evidence, direct evidence that substantiates it. So let's start with a standard but a very important challenge to this model, and it's the notion of interactionism. Now the idea of interactionism is that mind and body, though different, can causally interact. And this issue of how mind and body might interact arises from, I suppose, kind of standard ideas of dualism. The idea that mind and body are two different things. And this, there's different types of dualism, but basically you've got this idea that there are two different things, mind and body, and the question is, if they're that different, well then how could they interact? How could one influence the other? So the challenges to dualistic interactionism are these two. And I will say these are not actually, we will show that these aren't challenges to the Atma paradigm. They are challenges to the standard way that philosophers in the West have tried to separate what they think is mind and what they think is body. So the standard challenges are, first, how can two totally different things affect one another? And the second is that a mechanistic view of physical science suggests that a physical system like the brain should be impervious to influence from the non-physical realm. So they're saying, well, this is a kind of tenet of what we mean by physicalism, that if you've got the brain and that's a physical system, then non-physical stuff that we don't know about can't affect it. So those are the two kind of key challenges that are presented in this way. Now, my response from the Atma Paradigm's point of view is that, one, your concepts of mind and matter are naive in the, in the extreme. They're still based on the ideas of Descartes going back a few hundred years and his idea of substance dualism. Now, there's been variations of different types of dualism over the centuries, and philosophers still come up with them every so often in these days. But my opinion is that they are still rather naive. Secondly, that Western philosophy has not got into this topic in the same level of exploration of consciousness and reality as many of the Eastern meditative traditions. So we'll be presenting a lot more on this in part 2, which is coming up in a few weeks' time. So for now, I'm going to kind of just give a fairly simple addressing of this particular topic. And I would suggest that you don't dismiss the proposition of the Atma Paradigm on the basis of simplistic concepts of dualism and what people think is mind and what people think is matter, because there is a lot more interesting aspects to these that we will uncover. And as we go through the Atma Paradigm, you'll see why the interaction of consciousness and the physical aspects of the brain is not only possible, but it's obvious. The third point I would make is that you've said that there, in a mechanistic version of physics, that the physical realm should not be affected by the non-physical. But actually there's no real evidence or rationale to conclude that, because it goes back to the same issue we had with Hempel's dilemma in the past. Are you talking about what you understand physics to be now? Because your understanding of physics now does not provide an explanation of consciousness, so it cannot be complete. But at the same time, we know consciousness exists and we know consciousness is aware of the stuff in the brain. So there is an interaction between consciousness and the brain, but physics doesn't seem to explain it. And if you're going to say, well, physics in the future might, yes, but it might do it on the basis of showing how the physics that we know now can be affected by aspects of reality which we may not be including within the physics of today. So that challenge on the basis of what we expect from physics is irrelevant. And the fourth point I'd like to make, and we will be developing this in part 2 of the series Matter and Reality, is that information, and information is understood and defined in various ways within physics and different parts of science, but it's now kind of recognized that information is this kind of non-material aspect that pervades physical reality. It's there, but at the same time you can't touch it and play with it and observe it in the same way as the rest of physical reality. So it's a kind of non-material, non-physical stuff that's there. And the point is that information has a very obvious relationship with consciousness, especially as we have explained consciousness being the observer of information. So if the Atma is the observer of information and the brain and the physics of this world around us contain information, it is very natural that there should be some ability of consciousness to observe that information and to interact with it. So these three kind of elementary functions, we know that they're elementary and we know that they are different to what? To each other. For instance, we know that there's the experiencer and that is different to what we experience within our minds. We've kind of given the evidence for that. And we've seen how mental content, and particularly its qualities of qualia, are distinct from what exists within the brain and the rest of physical stuff. So these three functions are real, and that the experience of the outside world is achieved through their interactions. So there's no point saying such interaction between consciousness and the external world, or the brain and the interface of the mind, is impossible. There's no point saying that, because it is clearly happening. So the question is, how do we explain it? So it would be a better challenge to the Atma paradigm to say, okay, we know this, you're saying this interaction is happening, we know there must be some interaction between consciousness and the brain, but how does it work in terms of your model? And that would be a fair question. And that is a question that we will get into in detail. But in order to do that, we not only have to know what consciousness is, we have to be really clear what we mean by this thing called mind, and we need to be really clear about what is happening, what the physicality of matter, including our body and brain, is all about. Now, let's move on to another, as I say, that's a big topic. We will be covering that particularly in part 2 of this series. But for now, another challenge. Okay, you've given us an idea of 3 distinct functions. And now this, maybe people might say, well, this is overcomplex, because the brain model, which just says that all there is brain activity, postulates just one thing, the brain. And mind, consciousness, awareness, everything is just wrapped up in brain activity. So that's a really simple model. Even Descartes, his idea was simpler than what we're saying, because he said there's just 2 things, the brain and the mind. And now we're suggesting that you understand 3 elementary functions: Atma, mind, brain. So this surely contravenes the rules set up by William of Ockham, which is known these days as Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is based on the principle of parsimony. Parsimony means that you need to find the simplest scientific explanation that fits the evidence. And usually it's, this Occam's razor is stated as the simplest idea is the best. And the brain model is obviously much simpler than the Atma paradigm, because we're just using one thing, the brain, to make the explanation. So, brain model wins. Cha-ching, or does it? Well, the problem with using Occam's razor as I just have is that we've ignored the second part of the definition of parsimony, where it says, find the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. You can only use Occam's razor to decide between 2 or more theories that each offer equally satisfactory explanations. But what we have seen is the brain model doesn't offer a satisfactory explanation. And as we're about to see in this particular talk, it doesn't fit the evidence. In fact, the evidence goes right against it. So the brain model is not a valid comparison, because it doesn't have any explanatory value to consciousness. So it fails. And Occam's razor is not appropriate. Sometimes, though, Occam's razor is phrased in a more nuanced version, and I believe this is attributed to Bertrand Russell, when he said you should explain the unknown from that which is known. Now, I think some people might say, well, doesn't that favour the physicalist theory? After all, we know matter, and therefore we should try to produce an explanation of consciousness from what we know, matter. Now that sounds reasonable. But actually, if we say it again, you might see why it kind of sounds a little foolish. We know matter and should explain consciousness in terms of what we know about matter. Actually, this is irrational. And it's irrational because we say that we know matter more than we do consciousness. But what we have demonstrated through these various talks, and right from the beginning, is the fact of our own consciousness is the only thing we know for certain. And anything we know about matter has been discovered and explored only account of and by our consciousness. So matter is dull, inert stuff, and consciousness, we give a completely different value to it because it is the thing by which we know matter. So how can you think that you could explain consciousness from the point of view of matter? This is more than just illogical. This is almost insanity. Rather, let us take Occam's razor as Russell has defined it, and let's try to explain the nature of the physical world from the understanding of the one thing that is known, the fact of consciousness. That has to be our starting point. And that is the approach of the Atma Paradigm. And when I say Atma Paradigm, I'm doing so on the basis that I am bringing in many of the insights of other thinkers and traditions that have explored this aspect of the world from the point of view of consciousness. So now I promised that we would look at some of the scientific and medical evidence that substantiates the Atma Paradigm proposition that consciousness is a non-physical property. Now, and some of this evidence naturally then contradicts the brain model. So first, do we need a brain? And I'll start with a story of a 44-year-old man from France. His name was, well, in the literature he's named as Jacques. He was married with 2 children and living a normal life, working in the tax office. But in 2003, he felt some weakness in his left leg, so he went to his doctor. And a neurologist in Marseille, Dr. Fouillet, suspected that Jacques suffered from hydrocephalus, which is translated as water on the brain. And in these cases, the fluid that normally flows around the brain to cushion it produces large cavities in the brain material. It usually starts from a very early age and often within the womb. So in 85% of patients, this produces serious brain damage and learning difficulties. But in some cases, the effect does not seem to match the extensive damage. So Dr. Fouet carried out CAT and fMRI scans on Jacques, and what they saw kind of astonished them. Here's the photographs. The one on the left is cutting horizontally through the brain, and the other is from front to back. And the dark patches are just that, nothingness. There's no brain material there whatsoever. The only bit of brain material is a kind of thin layer around the outside. And you can compare this with a normal adult brain, which has all these functions and organs within. And on the bottom right, you can see the different kind of key functions that are there at the heart of the brain, plus all the cortical material around it. So somehow or other, Jacques was carrying on, practically speaking, a normal life without very much brain material. Just 2 or 3 years ago, there was a Channel 4 documentary featuring Noah Ward. Here he is, a photograph of him at 4 years old, and there is his brain at the time of birth. He had spina bifida, and when they did the scan of his brain, there was just 2% of the amount of brain that would normally expect for a child at birth. Somehow or other, the doctors were shocked that he survived, because the brain does have some important functions to do, particularly regulating our breathing, heart, and all sorts of autonomic processes within the body. But Noah, although he exhibited some learning difficulties to some degree, no one who saw the images and the footage of him from a baby through the next 4 years would say he's not a conscious person. Of course he was. He was happy, engaged, social, exhibiting all the aspects of full consciousness. despite the fact that there may have been some little learning difficulties that he was hampered by. So these examples trouble the brain model. They are not proof that consciousness exactly is a non-physical thing, but what they do show is that they challenge the proposition that it is the complexity of the human brain with all its neurons, with all its networks of connections. It's that complexity that produces the conscious experience that we accept. No, somehow or other consciousness is very happily residing and utilizing a brain with 2% of its normal aspect. So what this does show is kind of the neural plasticity and the ability of the networks in the brain to be restructured in ways that don't correspond to what you might expect through standard morphogenesis, i.e. how the body and the brain would develop within the womb. Somehow or other, you can have a very different set of cortical neurons, and somehow or other consciousness and the mind are able to utilize that and I suppose be accommodated very happily within the brain. So now we're on to some other studies. When clinicians talk about brain death, they define it as the irreversible loss of all functions of the brain, including the brainstem. Actually, some countries don't include the brainstem, some don't. But basically, once all the electricity has stopped within the brain and the brainstem, you say a person has gone. So the brain typically ceases functioning within 20 to 30 seconds after the heart has stopped. And the brain cannot resume until the heart is restarted and blood is pumping within it again. So the assumption is that with no electrical activity in the brain, there cannot be any cognitive or conscious experience. Because if consciousness is simply the electrical activity that is the brain is carrying out, and that's what produces consciousness, then if there's no electrical activity, if we're flatlined, technically there can be no conscious awareness. However, the awareness project, which called AWARE, which was aware during resuscitation, it was carried out by Dr. Sam Parnia of the Stony Brook University School of Medicine, but it covered a study of over 2,000 patients in 15 hospitals, and it was a study over 4 years in hospitals in UK, Austria and America. And their study of cardiac arrest. Now, cardiac arrest doesn't just mean having a heart attack, it just means that when the heart stops for whatever reason, whatever cause of death, heart stops, blood stops going to the brain, and then it's flatlined. So when they study those patients whose heart has stopped, where the brain has flatlined, they found evidence that consciousness continues for some time after that point. And so here's a summary of their findings. Out of all the persons they interviewed, 4% reported that while they were flatlined, they experienced nothing. Now that's a bit of a surprise. Only 4% said nothing. Some, 39%, claimed that they experienced some perception, but they couldn't be specific. It kind of was basically, well, I think I'm still here. You know, they were just aware that they were aware of being there, but not aware of any sensory activity. Whereas 46% felt that they had a broad range of mental recollections. They can remember having specific thoughts and emotions during this time when they were considered medically dead. They remembered confused feelings as what was happening. Am I dead? Would my family miss me? What's going to happen to me now? What will happen to them? And others could recall sounds and sensations about what was going around their hospital bed or on the operating table. And then out of another 9%, of Parnia's study reported what's termed NDEs, near-death experiences. And this is a typical percentage among similar studies. And then out of the final 2% experienced out-of-body experiences, OBEs. Now, sometimes out-of-body experiences are included within near-death experiences, but actually you can have an out-of-body experience without necessarily being near to death. And you can have near-death experiences without being a sense of being out of your body. But they do kind of both have features which actually provide evidence of consciousness existing at the time that the doctors would assume the brain is absolutely silent. There is nothing that could be experienced. So examples of the core experiences of near-death experiences. People feel peaceful, serene. They see themselves, they experience themselves being in another beautiful realm with vivid colors and enchanting music, and something they really are attracted to. Some very common is to sense a light, a white light, or a tunnel, and then quite often some kind of being of love, inviting or comforting them. Sometimes they meet discarnate figures, i.e. people who have died. Amazingly, they don't report seeing people who are alive. And that is a surprise, because if, as some of the challenges go, you'd say, well, as we heard, some people remember that they're leaving their family, but they don't see their family. They see those who have died. Only twice, actually, has there been any reports of seeing their dead pets, which a lot of people are very disappointed with, because they kind of have more affection for pets than maybe other family members. But apparently that's a very, very rare thing. And there's also a review of one's life, which comes very quickly. And people kind of get to kind of understand perhaps regrets or mistakes or something that they need to learn having that review. The sort of statements that people make is, all my pain just disappeared. I felt at peace and full of joy. There was a light, a tunnel. I saw a person, a being who was full of love, welcoming me. They showed me my life and helped me to understand my mistakes. Those are all typical. One of my friends told me about he was a devotee of Krishna, and he talked about his experience of a near-death, where he was greeted by many of the devotee friends, male and female, that he'd known in Krishna consciousness, but who had since passed on. And they were encouraging him, please come on to, and you can be with us and you can continue to serve in this way. But he got the message that no, his time was not right. And that's often another one where there's a kind of threshold that the people are aware that if they pass that threshold, they may not be coming back. But there is some reason for them to return. Now, sometimes in the West, it seems that most people who kind of come back say, it just wasn't my time. And the interesting thing is that in India, there's other reports where some people say, actually, apparently it was a mix-up, some kind of administrative mistake, where actually they weren't meant to take me, they were meant to get someone else. So that's maybe a different view of how administration works. For some, there is fear and torment, but that's actually quite rare, and surprisingly rare. Now, some of these aspects come into the out-of-body experiences, the freedom from pain. But in this case, one of the key aspects of an out-of-body experience is autoscopy, where you see your own body, but from a different point in space. You're looking down. Often it's happening during some kind of medical procedure, whether it's in the operating table or whether it's during some kind of resuscitation. And again, in this situation, there is heightened senses. There is ability to move at will. There's a deep memory of the event and verifiable veridical experiences. Veridical means that they connect with the outside world. You're not just experiencing an hallucination or some kind of feeling, but you're remembering an experience that actually connects with the outside world and has the potential to be verified. And there's also this aspect of not wishing to go back into your own body. So there's many examples of this. I'm going to give you a couple from those I have met and talked with. On the left actually is Dr. Penny Sartori. She's become a friend here in Wales. She was a nurse at the Morriston Hospital in Swansea and worked in the ICU and the trauma wards. And she was given permission by the hospital authorities to do a study of interviewing patients as soon as they woke up from coma or woke up from being resuscitated. So basically her shift was running from one patient to another, waiting for them to wake up. We did a radio program, and I was introduced to one of her patients, Michael, who talked about his story. And he explained how he was riding on his motorbike down a country lane, car pulled out, bang, the bike hit it, he went flying, and for a moment there was nothing. Then he felt, oh, well, I'm still here, that's great. And I don't seem to be hurt, I don't feel any pain, fantastic. But kind of, where am I? And he looked around and he saw his bike lying there. And then he saw that there was some action happening. Some people were running towards this thing, and there were some medics there, and they were all kind of looking down, and he thought, well, I better go and explore what this is. And he looked and he saw that was his own body lying there. And he could see the backs of the medics, as you can in this photograph. He was looking down on the body, he was hearing what they were saying, and he was able to describe it afterwards. So, and then at some point, he felt himself just being drawn back into the body, and that's when the pain began. But my favorite story is another from a very close friend who was being operated for a hernia operation. And he met the anaesthetist beforehand, who explained to him, don't worry, I'll be looking after you. You won't feel a thing during the whole thing. But in the middle of the operation, he woke up. Now, the anaesthetic had frozen his body, but he was awake, and he was aware of the surgeon slicing into his stomach and, poking around in there. And then the pain started, and he started, and it was just becoming more and more excruciating. He was trying to call out, he was trying to signal to the doctors, do something, I can feel this. But he couldn't move any aspect of his body. So he was just being tormented by this pain, becoming more and more severe, to the point he just thought, I can't handle it anymore. And then bang, he felt himself outside of his body and hovering in the air above the operating table, looking down, and no pain. He was all right. Okay, so grand, let them carry on doing the work they're doing. And I'm cutting out some of the details here, but he thought he would just go and explore, and thought, my friend was going to be sitting in the waiting room for me. I wonder if he's still awake, because he thought he was just going to kind of almost keep vigil there. So he felt himself then just moving along and through the walls, and found himself in the waiting room seeing that person, and he could see what he was doing and tell him and discuss it with him afterwards. Then, after a while being there, he thought he would return to the operating table, the operating room. When he got back there, he thought, well, I better see what's happening. Everything seemed to be okay, but then he saw the doctor, and the doctor was, in a cheerful mood, and he seemed to be demonstrating his golf swing. And when he was doing that with the scalpel, he nicked an artery, and then suddenly blood was pumping out of the stomach, and everyone panicked. The good mood, the happy kind of situation changed. They were now in kind of panic mode, trying to stem the blood, trying to stop this. And my poor friend just watching, thinking, this is it. This is me finished. I'm going now. But in that kind of, he just felt he needed to meditate on his kind of spiritual core and what was important to him. And in that moment, he felt reassurance that, no, this is not your time. This is okay. It will all work out fine. And he watched them doing it and then felt himself being brought back into the body and then out. The next thing he remembers is being wheeled away by the anaesthetist telling him, I told you wouldn't feel a thing. Later on, he met with the doctor and challenged him about that particular incident with the golf swing. So the doctor was obviously shocked to discover that his patient actually knew and had heard every single thing that he had done. So one of the aspects of OBEs is the profound effect that they have on the individual. They're not taken as hallucinations during a trauma. The individuals believe that they're real experience. In fact, many of them say it's more real than anything else they've ever experienced in their life. So to label it as hallucination actually affects them and in their ability to deal with them. Now, what they've seen is when they've interviewed these patients reporting OBEs and NDES, if they interview them after a period, the individuals report that they have a better appreciation for life, they have more concern for others, they have a heightened sense of purpose, and many of them develop a deeper sense of spirituality. What decreases is a fear of death. They kind of feel, I've been there, I've seen it, I know that I can exist separate from the body. There seems to be a decrease on their materialistic attitudes and their competitiveness. So those are all positive, but there are some negatives. Some of them start to doubt their sanity. And they do that because of the reaction they get from family, friends, society, doctors, or people they talk to. So it's not that the near-death experience has caused them a problem. It's actually the reaction of others to the fact that they are reporting something which seems to them strange, weird, mystic, spiritual, or whatever. And for whatever reason, there seems to be some kind of motivation to challenge or doubt it, or not want to discuss it. And that has an isolating effect on these individuals, which can often be quite hard to cope with. But there are many challenges to these reports. Of course there are. And I want to go through some of them. I can't do them in great detail, but I'd like just to kind of acknowledge the range of them and try and give some general feedback on them. So it's like the theories on consciousness. There's no real theory that challenges the idea that consciousness is non-material or explains it from the brain model. There's just lots of theories which don't really stand up. Similarly, there's lots of theories of what's going on in NDEs and OBEs. None of them stand up really. Here's the psychological batch. It's one group. And that is the expectation that this is somehow or other the brain trying to protect the consciousness from demise. Now, you've got to kind of unpack what's the brain and who's the brain trying to protect from what. That's a really weird thing. But what they found is that there doesn't seem to be any connection between what people believe in terms of their religion, their culture, their background, and what they experience. It's the actual things that they go through don't seem to correspond at all. And there are cultural differences, yes, but the cultural differences are only in very small details and in terms of sometimes interpretation. Like, for instance, if you meet a being of love, the question is, who do you interpret that as representing? You don't know, therefore the mind is left to kind of speculate on that. But the actuality of that as a core experiencing, meeting someone who you believe has your interests at heart, is an absolute kind of across the board experience. Sagan said, well, maybe these are birth memories. They're something, you know, they're going back to when you were born, and that's to do with the tunnel and coming out to see light. Well, according to the physicalist, the brain shouldn't be able to formulate memories that way. And other evidence shows that those born from cesarean section are just as likely to experience NDEs. Then there's the idea that there's some kind of depersonalization, which may be why you feel separate from your body or separate from your pain. But depersonalization in psychology is not a pleasant experience, whereas NDEs have the opposite. People say they are more alive, more lucid, more themselves than ever before. They actually feel more like their real self rather than not being themselves. And the final one of this one is kind of personality issues, whether one is susceptible to fantasy, hypnosis, or dissociative behavior, or maybe some kind of absorption in imagination or whatever. So these are not prominent in ND people. So although people might speculate, well, maybe they must be susceptible to fantasy, there's no evidence that that is a prominent trait in those who experience NDEs. So another group are the kind of neurological and physiological theories. The first are to do with blood gases, that maybe if there's a lack of oxygen or an excess of carbon dioxide in the blood, then this can set up effects of hypoxia, anoxia, or hypercarbia. So if that was true, then you would expect more NDE. If there's something that happens all the time, that there is an excess of oxygen or something, then why not more NDEs? However, in many of the studies, and Penny Sartori's particularly, they had quite a few cases where they were monitoring the blood gases within their patients throughout the times they were reporting NDEs, and showed that there was no excess of oxygen or no lack of oxygen and no excess of carbon dioxide that at those times. So doesn't seem to be a good explanation. And then there's an idea that there's some ketamine like action, which is, some people say, well, ketamine has the same effect as NDEs, but it's not the same. And there is no naturally occurring brain chemical that could have that effect. And if there was, and if there is an effect on kind of a brain chemical that produces an analgesic effect, that is long lasting. Whereas NDEs only report that the pain relief lasts as long as the NDE or the OBE experience, and that can be very short. That makes it distinctly different. Anatomical kind of activity, that's some kind of abnormal activity in the temporal lobes, because people have stuck in probes, and particularly to do with epilepsy seizures. But again, as one doctor said, I've seen hundreds of patients with temporal lobe seizures during all the decades of my professional life. I've never come across any of them that showed the same symptoms of NDEs as part of that seizure. And then the effects of a dying brain. But if the brain is dying and there's no activity, how is there conscious experience? And many NDEs happen when the brain is not dying, when there isn't actually a threat of death. there can still be an out-of-body experience. So, general refutations for these. Lucidity, that people report even when the brain is compromised, even when it is flatlined, they're experiencing very lucid awareness, clarity of their consciousness. And that is true even for dementia sufferers. Sometimes dementia sufferers have reported that for the first time in maybe years, they have been able to think clearly, have clear memories, clear thoughts, and it was actually a wonderful thing for them. So they're not confusional. They have heightened awareness, attention, and consciousness. These experiencing more real than real. And people retain vivid memories of these experiences for long times. But they also provide veridical reports that can be verified and synchronized with the time that the brain is known to have stopped functioning. Just as a quick one that comes into my mind as I'm speaking. Another person I met told of his mother how during her time in hospital, and it was in the operating theatre, somehow she came out of her body and she went and outside the window and she looked down and saw a shoe resting on the ledge just below the window of this kind of high-rise hospital. So when she was revived and she told the doctors, tell you, there's a shoe outside the window, which they were able to verify. Just a small example, but these are very insightful. They do mean something. People might ask, well, why not more people kind of experience it? Because it does seem to be between 6 and at best 20%. And I think most studies would say it's 10 to 12% would be the kind of a range that would experience those things. So that's not a high level. Why not more? Well, there is a reluctance to reveal or report. That's definitely a factor. But there's also the effect of drugs and resuscitation process. These eradicate and really affect memory formation and recall. Actually, just in the last week, my brother-in-law was admitted to hospital on Saturday with a heart attack. And he has come around, he's okay now, but the drugs that were used to help him resuscitate and to get through that have really hurt his memory for the time being. He's been in a very confused state, which is slowly kind of coming out of now. So there is that effect that somehow or other the drugs do not help in terms of either what is happening during a near-death or what's happening after and your memory of it. But still, I think that more study is needed to really understand why some people rather than others experience near-death experiences. Now, one point I'll make is Sam Parnia doesn't like this phrase near-death experience. He says, no, it's death, because clinically that's our definition of death. The brain has stopped functioning. But it's kind of very clearly not after death. These people have not died in that their life is still there. They continue to experience themselves connected with that body, or even though they nearly moved away or nearly crossed the threshold, still we wouldn't actually say they have crossed over into death. Somehow or other, I think the near-death title is much more appropriate. Now, got a question for you here. Have you experienced a near-death experience yourself? There's a little poll that's come up. Tell me if you've experienced either near-death or out-of-body experience or something along these lines. Okay? Have a go at that one. Now, it's said that extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that's true. But where is the extraordinary evidence that the brain produces consciousness? Why is it a more extraordinary claim that consciousness is non-neural than to claim that consciousness is produced by the brain? Why is that more extraordinary? Surely we should treat them on a level playing field. we've seen that there is no evidence, never mind extraordinary evidence, to substantiate the brain producing consciousness. But there does seem to be this evidence that needs to be looked at in order to explore the nature of consciousness. So remember that in, say, with the Large Hadron Collider, looking for the Higgs boson, we got 2 hits. After a lot of work, we got 2 hits. But how many hits do you need in order to establish that people who are flatline consciousness during that period experience veridical events that can be verified thereafter? How many of those do you need? So somehow or other they ask for evidence. When it's offered, it's just labeled metaphysics, paranormal. These are pejorative terms trying to dismiss this. This isn't real science. But what I've tried to quote you, obviously apart from the stories are part of the reports, but that there have been many, many, many studies of near-death and out-of-body experiences which do stand up to scientific scrutiny. I think one has to question the motivation. And I want you to consider this statement from Susan Blackmore, someone who has studied and devised many of the theories we've just, the challenges we've just gone through about near-death experiences. She says, if human consciousness can really leave the body and operate without a brain, then everything we know in neuroscience has to be questioned. If people could really gain paranormal knowledge, then much of physics needs to be written. This is what is at stake. Now that's my emphasis. This is what is at stake. So there obviously is motivation here. She doesn't want the physics books to be rewritten. But just wait a minute. Consider that you've got evidence that actually might help to substantiate that consciousness does not end when the body ends. But you would rather ignore that evidence because you're worried about rewriting the physics books. That shows a very poor judgment of the priorities and the importance of certain discoveries. You'd rather not rewrite the physics books than actually admit that perhaps there is evidence that consciousness can transcend the body. That really has to be questioned. So in terms of what she and others say, these are the challenges that are offered. You know, is this the end of science? Because is the study of consciousness empirical? Can you do a third-person analysis rather than a subjective analysis? And how do you do science with this theory? And do we have to throw out all our science? Now, I would kind of reply that primarily the study of consciousness is a first-person exploration, and I think that's valid because that is the consciousness we know best. But still, it can be empirical because it means what is learned by experience, and we can have a third-person methodology by which we share our results and observations and aggregate the common experiences, as Sam Parnia and others have done. There's also the biggest study probably is the University of Virginia. They reckon they've got 860 reports that they are dealing with on near-death and out-of-body experiences. And how do you do science? Well, the same way that any theory involving something that cannot be directly perceived by science, you have to explore a subtle property in terms of its interaction with less subtle things. So try to find evidence of its interactions. And that's the process that we use to try and find neutrinos. What can they interact with? What can dark matter interact with? We don't know how to kind of contact it directly, but maybe there is some kind of signal or signature of its interaction with something that we can measure. And that is also true of the Atma paradigm. We can apply the same procedure, and as with other aspects of nature that we cannot study directly, we just look for the interactions with the things we can observe and to the extent that we can measure them. So as we go deeper into the Atma paradigm, we'll demonstrate many of the ways that these interactions occur, and we'll present more evidence that supports the model that the Atma is the real and fundamental entity of consciousness. Will we have to throw out all our other science? No. We'll show that the Atma paradigm does not reject scientific evidence. It only requires us reassessing those interpretations and theories that are stuck because they haven't yet realized the role that consciousness plays in all sorts of physical and biological systems. So what I would suggest is that the Atma paradigm will open up some incredible opportunities for new discoveries, innovations, technologies and advances in medicine and science and in life in general. And of course, it's going to reveal some wonderful new insights into who we are as living beings in this world. So just like to give a little summary, but this is an opportunity for putting some questions using the Facebook chat. Also, there's a second poll coming up now, and that is, I previously asked you, did you personally have any near-death experiences? Now, tell me if there's anyone that you know of personally who has described to you a near-death or out-of-body experience. So a quick summary of where we've done today. The Atma Paradigm model resists the standard challenges of parsimony, i.e. Occam's razor, interactionism, or the challenges to interactionism, and dualism. There is strong empiric evidence within science to question the brain model, but that evidence supports the idea that consciousness is a non-neural phenomenon. And the Atma Paradigm can be developed to explore the interaction of consciousness and the mind and the physical systems of the brain and body. And this reveals further evidence and opens up some opportunities for amazing new discoveries and applications. So let me see how we are with our chat, and we have no questions so far. We've actually reached the end of our hour together, but I'd just like to mention what is happening. Next week I will give the 8th talk in this series of consciousness, and then straight after that we begin part 2 of the Atma Paradigm, which is to deal with matter and reality. And I actually think this is one of the most exciting sections of the Atma Paradigm. And we're going to start that on Thursday the 18th of June with a recap and an introduction, so that if you've got friends or anyone you know who hasn't been a regular listener to the Atma Paradigm, it's a great opportunity to invite them to, they'll hear a recap, but also something which then leads them straight and leads all of you into the next section. So even if they haven't attended these 8 talks, they can begin in 2-1 if they wish. So that's the list of talks that we've got coming up for the those 8 weeks. I think we need to conclude at this point. And again, thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to being with you next week, when we'll be looking at the subject of the Atma, the self and you, human identity, values and aspirations. Plus we're going to have a little look at consciousness in other species. Thank you very, very much. All the best.